This video will more clearly define, or in one instance, define for the first time, what it means for some terms that you'll need for the second AP practice. The first one, an overloaded method, is something pretty simple, but we haven't talked about it. Overloaded method is same name, different parameter list. And so you could have a method that takes two integers, or the same method that takes two doubles, the same named method that takes an integer and a double. What we'll do is we'll use the student class that we've talked about before. I've added some things to it to demonstrate all of these. And in the student class, the overloaded methods are simply going to be the constructors. Previously, I did say that toString was defined in a student class, and it lets the student print itself however the programmer wants or thinks that that's appropriate. And we're going to look at that both in the student class and in the driver. And then the brand new term is static or class variables. And you've encountered this a little bit when you looked up the libraries and the APIs, and it talked about the math class. If you were to use a method of the math class, you would not make a math object. You would just use the math identifier of the class to invoke an object, as in math.pow. So let me pull up the student code. And this is the same as it was before with a couple of additions. So I'll try to do them in the same order that I did on that worksheet. We would say that the constructor, and any class that has more than one constructor, is overloaded because it has the same name, student, of course, because it has no choice. Same name, different parameter list. Nothing in the parameter list, 4 things in the parameter list, another student in the parameter list. So overloaded means same method name, different parameter list. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, there are 3 methods that we're going to have individual lessons about. ToString, equals, and compare to. ToString, for this particular instance, we're going to look to see how a driver uses it. So this is a method that is very specific to Java, and it would always return a string. It would always have exactly this identifier, and it would never take any parameters. And so you see that we build a string, we make a string, we build it with any information that we want. In this particular case, their tests and their name, and in this particular case, their average. And then we return it, of course, because it needs to return a string. But what this does is if I just want to print out a student, I don't want to print out the hex address, right? We've already talked about that. I want to print out some information. And what I, as a programmer, decided was a good thing to do to have a student print out about itself was this information. Let's look at the driver. It's not really that important right now that we made some students, but we did make a student named Kelsey. She's called S1, is the identifier for her, for the student. And here's how we use toString. I say SOP, okay, system.out.println. The data for the student S1 is, so that's our literal string. But then right here, I print S1. Well, S1 is an object. It's a student object. And if it did not have toString defined, then it would print out the hex address. But it does have toString defined because I chose to do that. And therefore, it works just fine. So let's just go ahead and run this. And I made 3 different students, but here is, right over here, is the effect of this call right here. So you might kind of think it's weird that there's a method that we used and I didn't call it by name. Specifically, what I didn't do was do s1.toString. But I could have, and it would have been just fine. but I don't need to. So I'll run it again. Let me compile it. I'll run it again. And exactly the same thing is going to be printed out. So you can call the method like you're comfortable with. It is a student object invoking a method that's available. Or toString specifically, you can just write the object. And since toString is defined, it will print it. The last thing that you'll need for this AP practice is to know what it means to have a class data member. And a class data member is a data member that is not specific to any particular object. For instance, if we look over here, these objects were made right here in the driver. S1 was made, S2 was a new student, and S3 was made. Those three objects were made, and they have information in their private data members. They each have a string and 3 ints that define them. That is specific to each of those as a student object. A class variable is not specific to any object, and here's how you declare it. Usually, you don't want anybody accessing it. A class variable must be static, and that's a different use of the keyword static. This particular one is an integer, and so I named it student count, because what I might want to do is ask how many student objects were made. I don't care about any individual student. I just want to know how many they were made. And you can see this part of the output that I didn't outline or call our attention to before says the quantity of students attending this school is 3. Well, we see that there were 3 students made up here. Let's look at the driver. And right down here at the very bottom is where I use the class data member. SOP, the quantity of students attending this school is, and then what I append to that output is student.getStudentCount. With a student object, invoke one of the methods available as a class method. So let's go back here again. I have a class variable, student count, and with that class variable, I could set the student count, which I did not illustrate, or I could get the student count. The only thing that can interact with a class variable are class methods, static methods, to interact with this static variable. Once again, you have used, probably by now, methods from the math class, and what you did was you said math.pow. In that same sense, we have used student to grab a student method. That's what it means to have a class variable and a class method. You invoke them with the class identifier, not with any particular object. All right, so you should be good to go on the second AP practice now.